Thomas Bradley's school bus headlights sliced through the Montana blizzard when his heart stopped, not from the cold, but from recognition. The dark shape beside Highway 94 wasn't roadkill. It lifted its head, and amber eyes caught his beams like distress flares from a battlefield he'd left behind. Military dog tags glinted against matted fur. Blood dotted the snow in perfect crimson circles, same pattern as the IED crater outside Fallujah where his convoy should have died, but didn't, because someone's K9 partner had cleared the route first. The German shepherd's ribs showed through thin coat like prison bars. Thomas knew that look. He'd seen it in his bathroom mirror every morning since Sarah's funeral. The look of something broken, trying to remember how to breathe. Man and dog stared across the frozen highway. Two veterans, two survivors. Neither knowing this December morning would shatter everything they thought they knew about second chances, sacrifice, and the debts we owe to those who saved us without asking why. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Bradley had driven Route 7 for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. He knew every pothole between Millbrook Elementary and the county line, every farm dog that chased his yellow bus, every mailbox that needed replacing. What he didn't know was how a man could live 58 years and still feel like he was waiting for his life to begin. The double-wide trailer on Elk Ridge Road held the sum total of his existence. Sarah's coffee mug still in the sink, her reading glasses on the nightstand, a Purple Heart gathering dust beside unpaid medical bills. The Army had taught him to defuse bombs, but nobody taught him how to defuse the silence that followed a funeral. Every morning at 5:30, Thomas made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, a joke that stopped being funny after Sarah died. He'd sit at their kitchen table, watching the Weather Channel predict storms that never seemed to touch his part of Montana. The meteorologist always sounded so certain about what was coming. Thomas envied that certainty. His route started at 6:15 sharp. 43 kids from kindergarten through 8th grade, each with their own story. He wasn't supposed to know, but did anyway. There was Emma Martinez, whose father worked 3 jobs to keep their farm afloat. Billy Hutchinson, the sheriff's grandson, who still flinched at loud noises since his dad came back from overseas. And Tommy Morrison, who missed more school than he attended, always with bruises his Uncle Frank explained away with stories about falls and accidents that happened too frequently to be accidents. Thomas had learned not to ask questions. Small towns had their own ecosystem of secrets, and bus drivers who wanted to keep their jobs understood the difference between seeing and noticing. He transported children safely from point A to point B. Nothing more, nothing less. The Army had been different. In Afghanistan, noticing details kept you alive. The color of dirt that meant fresh digging, the way local kids avoided certain streets, the silence that came before explosions. Thomas had been good at reading signs, good enough to bring most of his unit home alive, but civilian life didn't reward vigilance. Civilian life punished veterans who saw too much, felt too much, remembered too much. So Thomas had learned to drive his route with tunnel vision, focusing on the road ahead instead of the stories unfolding in his rearview mirror. Until this morning, when the blizzard made him stop. December 20th arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing hurt. Thomas finished his morning route under skies the color of old pewter, watching his breath fog the windshield as he pulled into the depot. The radio crackled with weather warnings. Another storm system moving in from the northwest, expected to dump 8 inches by evening. Principal Dorothy Chen was waiting for him in the transportation office, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She'd been running Millbrook Elementary for 23 years and had the kind of quiet authority that made grown men straighten their shoulders without realizing it. "Thomas, I have a favor to ask." She set a cardboard box on his desk. "Christmas packages for our homebound students." Would you mind making deliveries this afternoon? The storm's going to make it impossible tomorrow." Thomas lifted the box, heavier than expected. Inside were wrapped gifts, handmade cards, and small bags of homemade cookies. The kind of thoughtful gestures that kept small communities alive when everything else was dying. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. How many stops?" "7. I've mapped the route." She handed him a folded paper with careful directions. "Last stop is the Morrison place. Tommy's been out all week with what Frank calls family circumstances." Thomas knew Frank Morrison by reputation, a hard man made harder by circumstances nobody talked about openly. Word around town was that Frank had served overseas, came back different, and never quite found his footing. The kind of veteran who fell through the cracks of a system that promised care but delivered bureaucracy. The first 6 deliveries went smoothly. Elderly Mrs. Patterson, whose arthritis kept her housebound in winter. The Williams twins, recovering from pneumonia. Each stop reminded Thomas why he'd stayed in Millbrook after Sarah died. These people weren't just neighbors, they were family in the way small towns created family from necessity and choice. The Morrison Ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen a snowplow all winter. Thomas's bus struggled through the ruts, engine whining in protest. The property looked like it was slowly surrendering to neglect. Sagging fence posts, rusted equipment scattered in the yard, a barn that leaned precariously to one side. The double-wide trailer showed signs of habitation but not maintenance. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and a pickup truck sat buried to its axles in snow. Thomas parked near the front steps and grabbed Tommy's package from the box. That's when he saw the dog. The German Shepherd was chained to a 50-gallon oil drum behind the trailer, maybe 30 feet from any shelter. The chain was short enough that the animal couldn't reach the barn or even the trailer's overhang. Snow had drifted around the drum, creating a small prison of white. Thomas had seen neglected animals before. Rural poverty made difficult choices necessary. But this was different. This was deliberate. The dog lifted its head as Thomas approached the trailer, and something in that movement triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. Military precision in the way it came to attention. A bearing that spoke of training, discipline, purpose. Frank Morrison answered the door on the 3rd knock, and the smell of stale alcohol and unwashed clothes rolled out like a physical presence. He was a big man, gone soft around the middle, with the kind of 5-day beard that suggested he'd stopped caring about appearances some time ago. "What do you want?" His voice carried the rasp of someone who'd spent too many nights drinking alone. "Package from school." "For Tommy." Thomas held up the wrapped box, keeping his tone neutral. Frank squinted at him through bloodshot eyes. "School sending charity now?" "Christmas gifts, from his teacher and classmates." "Charity," Frank repeated. But he stepped aside to let Thomas enter. The trailer's interior matched its exterior, functional but defeated. A wood stove provided heat, and the television played a talk show at low volume. Empty beer cans crowded the coffee table, and the air held the stale smell of a closed space that needed airing. "Tommy!" Frank called toward the back of the trailer. "Get out here!" A small boy appeared from what must have been a bedroom, thin and pale with the kind of careful posture that suggested he'd learned to move quietly. 7 years old, according to school records, but his eyes held an older person's wariness. "Hi, Mr. Bradley." Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Hey there, Tommy. Your class made you something special." Thomas handed him the package, watching the boy's face light up with genuine surprise. "Can I open it?" Frank waved dismissively. "Go ahead." Tommy tore into the wrapping with the focused intensity of a child who didn't often receive gifts. Inside were hand-drawn pictures from his classmates, a small toy truck, and a bag of chocolate chip cookies. "Tell them thank you," Tommy said seriously. "Tell them I miss school." "When are you planning to send him back?" Thomas asked Frank. Frank's expression hardened. "When I decide he's ready. Kid's been sick." Thomas looked at Tommy, who didn't look sick so much as scared. But he'd learned not to push in situations like this. Small-town politics required delicate navigation, especially when it came to family matters. Well, these should help him feel better. Thomas headed for the door, then paused. "That's a beautiful dog you have out there." The change in Frank's demeanor was instant and startling. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists. "That's not a beautiful anything. That's a worthless piece of government garbage that should have been put down years ago." The venom in Frank's voice made Tommy flinch and step backward. Thomas felt his own tension spike, a familiar response to unexpected hostility. "Sorry, I just noticed he looks like a working dog." "Working dog?" Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what kind of work military dogs do? They get good men killed, that's what they do. They freeze up when you need them most, and then you bury your brother in a flag while some colonel tells you how sorry he is for your loss." The pieces clicked into place. Frank Morrison had lost someone overseas, someone close, and somehow he'd transferred that grief onto the animal chained outside his trailer. "I should go," Thomas said quietly. "Storm's coming." "Yeah, you should." Frank followed him to the door. "And don't come back here talking about that dog. What I do with my property is my business." Thomas walked to his bus, his mind churning. As he turned the key in the ignition, he glanced back at the dog. The German Shepherd was watching him, and in that moment of eye contact, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's funeral, the absolute certainty that he was being called to action. The question was whether he had the courage to answer. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the German Shepherd's face, the intelligent brown eyes that held too much knowledge, the way the animal had watched him leave with what looked like resignation. By 2:30 a.m., he gave up trying to rest and made coffee, sitting at his kitchen table while wind rattled the trailer's thin walls. Sarah's photographs smiled at him from the windowsill, taken during their honeymoon in Glacier National Park. She'd always been the one who acted when action was needed, who couldn't walk past suffering without stopping to help. Thomas had loved that about her, even when it complicated their lives. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered to the empty kitchen. But he already knew the answer. Sarah would have marched back to that ranch, confronted Frank Morrison, and found a way to save that dog. She wouldn't have spent the night wrestling with doubt and protocol and the fear of making things worse. By dawn, Thomas had made his decision. He would drive back to the Morrison place, not to interfere, but to check, maybe bring some dog food as a neighborly gesture, feel out the situation, see if there was a way to help without causing more problems for the animal. The storm had moved through during the night, leaving behind the kind of crystalline mourning that made Montana winters almost worth enduring. Thomas drove the bus along Highway 94, then turned onto the dirt road leading to Frank's ranch. The fresh snow made the property look almost peaceful, hiding the rust and neglect under a pristine white blanket. Frank's pickup truck was gone, unusual for this early in the morning. Thomas parked where he couldn't be seen from the trailer and walked through the snow toward the back of the property. The German Shepherd was exactly where he'd been the day before, but now Thomas could see the full extent of the animal's condition. The dog was thin to the point of emaciation, his ribs clearly visible through a coat that should have been thick and lustrous. The water bowl was frozen solid, and there was no sign of food anywhere within the chain's reach. Thomas approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The dog lifted his head but didn't bark or growl. Instead, he watched Thomas with an alertness that suggested military training, assessing threat level, calculating options. "Easy, boy," Thomas said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." As he got closer, Thomas could see details that made his chest tighten. The dog's collar was too tight, cutting into the fur around his neck. Recent wounds marked his muzzle, fresh enough to still be healing, and around his neck, barely visible under the matted fur, was a military dog tag. Thomas knelt in the snow, extending his hand palm up. The dog sniffed cautiously, then allowed Thomas to touch his head. The animal's skull felt fragile under Thomas's fingers, lacking the solid muscle mass of a healthy German shepherd. With careful movements, Thomas lifted the dog tag to read it. The metal was tarnished but legible. Sergeant, K-9 Unit, 3rd Infantry Division, Iraq, 2016-2019. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. 3rd Infantry Division. He'd worked with K-9 units from the 3rd ID during his second deployment to Afghanistan. This wasn't just any dog. This was a veteran, a soldier who'd served his country and earned retirement with dignity. "Jesus, Sergeant," Thomas whispered. "What happened to you?" The dog, Sergeant, seemed to recognize something in Thomas's voice. His tail moved slightly, the first sign of hope Thomas had seen. With gentle pressure, Thomas examined the animal's body, finding evidence of systematic neglect and abuse. This wasn't poverty or ignorance causing the suffering. This was deliberate. Thomas broke the ice in the water bowl and poured warm coffee from his thermos into it. Sergeant drank gratefully, his tongue working desperately to consume every drop. From his jacket pocket, Thomas pulled out the sandwich he'd packed for lunch, ham and cheese on wheat bread. He tore it into small pieces, feeding them to Sergeant one at a time. The dog ate with the controlled urgency of an animal who'd learned not to expect regular meals. Each piece was consumed completely before accepting the next, military discipline overriding starvation. "I know you, don't I?" Thomas said quietly, studying Sergeant's face. "Afghanistan, maybe Iraq. You were there, weren't you, boy?" Sergeant's ears perked up at the tone, recognizing something familiar in Thomas's voice. In that moment, Thomas felt a connection that transcended species, two veterans recognizing each other across the gap between human and animal. Thomas fashioned a windbreak from his jacket, creating a small shelter against the oil drum. It wasn't much, but it would help cut the wind. As he worked, he talked to Sergeant in the calm, authoritative voice he'd used with military working dogs overseas. "I'm going to help you, soldier. I don't know how yet, but I won't leave you here to die." Sergeant's response was to rest his head against Thomas's leg, a gesture of trust that nearly broke Thomas's heart. The sound of an approaching engine made both man and dog freeze. Frank's pickup truck was returning earlier than expected. Thomas had minutes to get back to his bus before being discovered. "I have to go now," he told Sergeant urgently, "but I'll be back. That's a promise." Thomas ran through the snow to his bus, his heart pounding with adrenaline and purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the Army. As he drove away, he watched Sergeant in his side mirror until the dog disappeared behind snow-covered trees. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Bradley had a mission. And like every mission that mattered, failure wasn't an option. He spent the drive back to town planning his next move, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like familiar gear. Sergeant was counting on him now, and Thomas refused to let another soldier down. Not today. Not ever again. Thomas spent the rest of December 21st researching everything he could about military working dogs, animal welfare laws, and the legal complexities of intervening in suspected abuse cases. What he learned wasn't encouraging. Montana's animal cruelty statutes required clear evidence of deliberate harm, and rural law enforcement agencies were notoriously reluctant to intervene in property disputes without compelling proof. He called the county animal control office and spoke to a weary-sounding woman named Janet, who explained that they'd need photographic evidence, veterinary documentation, or multiple witness statements to take action. "Sir, we get a lot of calls about farm animals that city folks think are being mistreated." Most of the time, it's just rural life looking different than suburban life. This isn't about livestock standards, Thomas said. This is a military working dog being systematically abused. Do you have proof it's military? I saw the dog tags. And you're certain the owner doesn't have legal documentation proving ownership? Thomas had to admit he wasn't certain of anything except what he'd witnessed. The conversation ended with Janet promising to look into it when staffing permits, which Thomas correctly interpreted as bureaucratic code for probably never. His next call was to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the only veterinarian within 50 miles who made house calls to remote ranches. Her receptionist explained that Dr. Rodriguez was attending an emergency surgery in Billings and wouldn't be available until the following week. Could she make an exception for an emergency? Thomas asked. Is the animal in immediate life-threatening danger? Thomas thought about Sargent's condition, the visible ribs, the frozen water bowl, the wounds on his muzzle. Yes? Then the owner needs to bring the animal to the emergency clinic in Great Falls. We can provide a referral. The owner isn't going to do that. There was a pause. Sir, I understand your concern, but we can't force veterinary care on privately owned animals without a court order. Thomas hung up, feeling frustrated and helpless. The system that should protect vulnerable animals was designed to protect property rights instead. Sargent was suffering, and every legal avenue seemed to lead to dead ends and waiting periods the dog might not survive. That evening, he drove past the Morrison Ranch again. Frank's truck was there, and smoke rose from the trailer's chimney, but Thomas couldn't see Sargent from the road. He parked on the highway shoulder and walked through the snow to get a better view. Sargent was huddled against the oil drum, barely visible in the gathering darkness. The windbreak Thomas had fashioned that morning was gone, either blown away by wind or deliberately removed. The dog wasn't moving. Thomas's military training kicked in. He approached with tactical awareness, using the barn and outbuildings for concealment. As he got closer, he could hear Frank's voice from inside the trailer, loud, angry, apparently arguing with someone on the phone. I don't give a damn what the VA says about PTSD. I'm fine. It's everyone else who's got problems. Thomas crept closer to Sargent, staying low and moving slowly. The dog lifted his head as Thomas approached, recognition flickering in his eyes. Thomas knelt in the snow and gently touched Sargent's neck, checking for a pulse. The heartbeat was rapid but steady, and the dog was shivering, a good sign that meant his body was still fighting hypothermia. Hey, soldier, Thomas whispered. Still hanging in there? Sargent's tail moved weakly, and he pushed his muzzle against Thomas's gloved hand. The trust in that gesture, after everything Frank had done to him, struck Thomas as profoundly heartbreaking and inspiring. From his jacket, Thomas pulled out the supplies he'd brought, a thermos of warm broth, more sandwiches, and a wool blanket he'd taken from his own bed. He poured broth into his cupped palm, letting Sargent lap it up slowly. The dog drank with desperate gratitude, his body trembling with the effort. Thomas wrapped the blanket around Sargent as best he could, securing it with safety pins to keep it from slipping off. It wasn't much against the Montana winter, but it was something. I'm working on getting you out of here, Thomas promised. I just need more time. Sargent leaned into Thomas's warmth, and for a moment they sat together in the snow, two veterans who'd found each other across years and species and the vast distance between war and peace. The trailer door slammed open, and Frank's voice carried across the yard. Who's out there? I got a shotgun. Thomas froze, calculating distances and cover options. Frank was drunk. His voice had the slurred belligerence of someone who'd been drinking alone for hours. Confronting him now would be dangerous for everyone, especially Sargent. Probably just coyotes, Frank muttered to himself, but his footsteps crunched closer through the snow. Thomas had seconds to decide. He could run, leaving Sargent behind, or he could stay and face whatever Frank decided to do. The choice felt like every important decision he'd made since leaving the army. Stay safe or do what's right. He stayed. Frank appeared around the corner of the trailer, silhouetted against the light from his doorway. He was carrying a shotgun, holding it with the casual familiarity of someone who'd grown up around firearms. When he spotted Thomas kneeling beside Sargent, his face went through a sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally rage. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Thomas stood slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. "I was checking on the dog. He looked like he might be in distress." "I told you yesterday that dog is none of your business." Frank raised the shotgun to a ready position, not quite aiming, but making his intent clear. "Frank, that's a military working dog. He served his country. He deserves better than this." "Deserves?" Frank's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You want to talk about what people deserve? My brother Kyle deserved to come home from Iraq. He deserved to marry his girlfriend and have kids and grow old. But he didn't get any of that because some military dog failed to do its job." The pain in Frank's voice was raw and immediate, cutting through the alcohol and anger to reveal the grief underneath. Thomas recognized that tone. He'd heard it in group therapy sessions at the VA, in late-night phone calls from fellow veterans who couldn't sleep, in his own voice during the months after Sarah's funeral. "Frank, I'm sorry about your brother, but this dog didn't fail anyone. Look at his tags. He served with honor." "Honor?" Frank spat. "You know what honor gets you? A folded flag and a grateful nation that forgets your name before the funeral's over." Thomas took a half-step closer, his own military bearing asserting itself despite the circumstances. "Your brother would be ashamed of what you're doing to that dog." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. His face contorted with rage, and for a moment Thomas thought the man might actually shoot him. Instead, Frank lowered the gun and began to sob, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. "Kyle loved dogs," Frank whispered between sobs. "Always had strays following him home. Mom used to say he could talk to animals better than people, and when he joined the Marines, he specifically requested K-9 training because he wanted to work with them." Thomas waited, sensing that Frank needed to tell this story. "He was partnered with a dog named Rex. Beautiful German Shepherd, just like that one." Frank gestured toward Sargent with the barrel of his gun. "Kyle wrote home about Rex all the time. How smart he was. How loyal. How they trusted each other completely." Frank wiped his eyes with his sleeve, leaving streaks in the dirt on his face. Then came the day everything went wrong. Kyle and Rex were clearing buildings in Fallujah when insurgents opened fire. Kyle got separated from his unit, pinned down in a doorway. Rex was supposed to guard his six, supposed to alert him to threats. The story was spilling out now, as if Frank had been carrying it alone for too long. But when the shooting started, Rex bolted, just ran away, and left Kyle there alone. Kyle died trying to reach his unit without backup. Thomas felt his heart sink as he began to understand the depth of Frank's trauma. "Frank, I'm so sorry. The Army told me Rex was found 3 days later, shot by insurgents while trying to get back to Kyle's body. They said the dog was a hero, that he'd tried to save my brother. But I know the truth. Rex ran because he was a coward, and Kyle died because of it." Frank raised the shotgun again, this time pointing it directly at Sargent. "So when the military surplus program offered me a retired war hero, I figured it was the least they could do. Let me have one of their precious dogs to do with what I wanted." Thomas stepped between the gun and Sargent, his own voice shaking with controlled anger. "So you've been torturing an innocent animal to get revenge for something that happened to a completely different dog?" "They're all the same," Frank screamed. "Military dogs, civilian dogs, doesn't matter. When the shooting starts, they all run." "That's not true, and you know it. Thomas's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been in combat, who'd seen military working dogs in action. "I've watched K-9 teams clear buildings, search for IEDs, guard convoys. Those dogs don't run. They do their jobs even when they're scared, even when they're hurt." Frank's grip on the gun wavered. "You weren't there. You don't know what happened." "No, I wasn't there. But I know what PTSD looks like. And I know what grief can do to a person's judgment." Thomas took another step closer. "Frank, you're not honoring your brother's memory by torturing that dog. You're dishonoring everything Kyle stood for." The two men faced each other across 10 feet of snow-covered ground, the weight of their shared military experience creating a tension that had nothing to do with the weapon between them. In the silence they could hear Sargent breathing, rapid, shallow pants that spoke of pain and exhaustion and a spirit that refused to give up. Finally, Frank lowered the gun. "Get off my property," he said quietly. "Take your bleeding heart and your lectures and get out of here." Thomas looked down at Sargent, who was watching the exchange with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should have to understand. "I'll leave," Thomas said, "but I'm coming back. And next time, I'm bringing people who can help that dog whether you want them to or not." Frank didn't respond, just turned and walked back toward his trailer. Thomas knelt beside Sargent one more time, adjusting the blanket and whispering promises he hoped he could keep. As he walked back to his bus, Thomas felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Legal channels had failed. Reason had failed. Frank Morrison was too damaged by his own trauma to recognize the trauma he was inflicting. That left Thomas with options he didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes saving a life required risking everything else. Thomas Bradley had spent 3 years avoiding difficult choices, hiding from responsibility, letting other people make the decisions that mattered. But as he drove away from the Morrison ranch, leaving Sargent behind in the snow, he knew those days were over. Tomorrow, he would stop being a bystander and start being a soldier again. December 22nd dawned with the kind of brutal cold that made metal burn skin and breath freeze in lungs. Thomas completed his morning bus route mechanically, his mind consumed with planning. He'd spent the previous evening making phone calls, researching legal precedents, and mapping out contingencies. Every scenario led to the same conclusion. Saving Sargent would require breaking laws. The first call had been to Sheriff Wade Hutchinson, a conversation that confirmed Thomas's worst fears about official channels. Wade was a decent man, but he was also Frank's drinking buddy and a fellow veteran who understood the unspoken codes that governed rural Montana. "Tom, I appreciate your concern," Wade had said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd handled too many difficult situations with no good solutions. "But Frank Morrison owns that dog legally. Unless you can prove immediate life-threatening abuse with documentation, my hands are tied." "What about the military service angle? Doesn't that change anything?" "Retired military working dogs are considered surplus property, same as old Jeeps or office equipment. Once they're sold through the surplus program, they're private property with no special protections." Thomas had pressed harder. "Wade, I saw that dog. He's dying. Then convince Frank to surrender him voluntarily or find a way to document the abuse that would hold up in court." "But Tom?" Wade's voice had carried a warning. "Don't do anything stupid. Frank's got a temper. He's armed, and he's got legal right to protect his property. I don't want to be investigating a shooting over a dog." The conversation had ended with Thomas understanding that he was truly alone in this fight. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, protecting property rights over everything else, including the suffering of a fellow veteran who happened to walk on 4 legs instead of 2. His second call had been to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, catching her between appointments at a ranch outside Choteau. She'd listened to his description of Sargent's condition with professional attention, asking detailed questions about the dog's behavior, physical appearance, and environment. "From what you're describing, that animal needs immediate veterinary intervention," she'd said. "Prolonged exposure to those conditions could cause permanent damage or death. Would you be willing to make an emergency house call?" There had been a long pause. "Mr. Bradley, I'd need the owner's consent for any examination or treatment. Without that, I could lose my license." What if the owner wasn't there? What if someone found the dog abandoned and called for help? Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Bradley, I can't advise you to do anything illegal, but I can tell you that if a concerned citizen found an abandoned animal and requested emergency veterinary care, I would respond to that call." The conversation had ended with Dr. Rodriguez providing her emergency contact number and a careful explanation of the documentation she would need to justify emergency treatment of an animal whose ownership was disputed. Thomas's third call had been the hardest, to his own conscience. He'd sat in his trailer that night, staring at Sarah's photograph and having the kind of conversation he'd avoided for 3 years. "I know what you'd tell me to do," he'd said to her image. "You'd say that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same thing. You'd say that laws are made by people, but compassion comes from something higher." He'd remembered their conversation about civil disobedience during the early days of their marriage when Sarah had volunteered with sanctuary movements that helped undocumented immigrants. She'd faced potential federal charges for providing food and shelter to people fleeing violence, and Thomas had worried about her safety, her future, the risks she was taking. "Some things are worth the risk," she'd told him then. "Some things are so right that not doing them would be wrong, regardless of what the law says." Now, sitting alone in the same kitchen where they'd had that conversation, Thomas understood what Sarah had meant. Legal wasn't always moral. Safe wasn't always right. And sometimes a person had to choose between following rules and following conscience. December 23rd brought news that forced Thomas's hand. Principal Chen called him into her office with information that made waiting impossible. "I had a concerning conversation with Tommy Morrison yesterday," she said, closing her office door for privacy. "He called the school from his neighbor's house while his uncle was in town." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "What did he say?" "Tommy's scared. Frank's been drinking more heavily than usual, and yesterday he told Tommy that he was going to solve the dog problem on Christmas Eve. Tommy thinks Frank means to shoot the dog." The words hit Thomas like cold water. Christmas Eve was tomorrow. Whatever he was going to do, it had to happen today. "Did Tommy say anything else?" "He asked if dogs go to heaven when they die. He wanted to know if his friend Hunter, that's what he calls the dog, would be okay after Uncle Frank fixes him." Mrs. Chen's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Tom, I've been an educator for 23 years. I know when a child is traumatized." Thomas thought about 7-year-old Tommy Morrison, already carrying the weight of adult fears and adult knowledge of cruelty. Another casualty of Frank's unresolved grief, another life damaged by trauma passing from one generation to the next. What are our options? Officially, I can report suspected child endangerment to social services, but that's a process that takes weeks or months. Unofficially? Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tommy gave me his neighbor's phone number. The Hendersons live about a mile from the Morrison place. Mrs. Henderson has been watching Tommy when Frank goes to town, and she's willing to help if we need to. Coordinate timing." Thomas understood the implication. Mrs. Henderson could provide information about Frank's movements, creating opportunities for intervention. It wasn't quite conspiracy, but it was close enough to make Thomas's heart race. "Mrs. Chen, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Her voice carried the steel that had made her an effective principal for 2 decades. "That dog isn't the only one being abused in that household, Tom. and sometimes the system moves too slowly to save lives. Thomas spent the afternoon preparing with military precision. He mapped Frank's typical schedule based on 3 days of observation. Frank usually drove to town between 10 a.m. and noon for supplies and drinking. The trip took at least 2 hours, sometimes longer if he stopped at Murphy's Tavern. Thomas assembled equipment: bolt cutters for the chain, a leather leash, blankets, first aid supplies, and dog food. He contacted Dr. Rodriguez and arranged for her to be standing by at her clinic. Most importantly, he prepared mentally for the consequences of what he was about to do. At 6 p.m., Mrs. Henderson called with the information Thomas needed. Frank left for town an hour ago. Truck was loaded with empty bottles, so he's planning a long evening at Murphy's. I'd say you have at least 4 hours, maybe more. Thomas felt his training take over as he drove toward the Morrison Ranch. The same calm focus that had carried him through bomb disposal missions settled over his mind. He wasn't Thomas Bradley, the bus driver, anymore. He was Sergeant First Class Bradley on an extraction mission. The ranch was dark except for a single light in Tommy's bedroom window. Thomas parked on the highway and approached on foot, using cover and concealment techniques he hadn't needed for 8 years. The snow crunched under his boots, but the wind covered most sounds. Sergeant was where Thomas expected him to be, chained to the oil drum behind the trailer. But the dog's condition had deteriorated dramatically in just 2 days. He was lying motionless in the snow, and for a terrifying moment, Thomas thought he was too late. Then Sergeant lifted his head, and Thomas saw recognition flicker in the animal's eyes. The dog tried to stand but couldn't manage it. His body was too weakened by cold and starvation. "Easy, soldier," Thomas whispered, kneeling in the snow. "Help's here." He wrapped Sergeant in blankets, then used the bolt cutters to snap the chain. The sound of metal parting seemed impossibly loud in the winter silence, but no lights came on in the trailer. Tommy was probably asleep, exhausted by the stress of living with Frank's escalating instability. Sergeant weighed less than Thomas expected, maybe 60 pounds instead of the 80 or 90 a healthy German shepherd should carry. Thomas lifted the dog carefully, feeling the prominent ribs and hip bones through the thin fur. "We're going home, boy," Thomas murmured as he carried Sergeant toward his truck. "You're safe now." As they reached the vehicle, Sergeant raised his head and looked back toward the trailer where Tommy Morrison slept. And the dog's eyes held an intelligence that transcended species. He understood that he was being rescued, but he also understood that someone else was being left behind. Thomas followed Sergeant's gaze to Tommy's lighted window. The boy was probably the only kind presence the dog had known during his captivity, and leaving felt like abandonment. "I know," Thomas said quietly, "but we'll find a way to help him too. One rescue at a time." He settled Sergeant in the truck's cab, cranking the heat and wrapping him in additional blankets. The dog rested his head against Thomas's leg, a gesture of trust that nearly broke Thomas's heart. As they drove away from the Morrison Ranch, Thomas felt the weight of irrevocable change. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, committed an act that would define the rest of his life. Whether that definition would be hero or criminal depended on factors beyond his control. But as he felt Sergeant's breathing grow stronger and steadier with each mile of heated air and gentle handling, Thomas knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. Some lives were worth saving, regardless of the cost. The real test would come tomorrow, when Frank Morrison discovered that his prisoner was gone and Thomas Bradley became a fugitive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of Millbrook like a beacon of hope in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas had called ahead from his truck, and she was waiting in the parking lot when he arrived, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She wore scrubs under a heavy winter coat, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that spoke of someone accustomed to emergency calls at inconvenient hours. "How is he?" she asked as Thomas carefully lifted Sargent from the truck's cab. "Weak, but breathing steady. He's been trying to lift his head during the drive." Dr. Rodriguez led them into the clinic, flipping on lights as they moved through the reception area toward the examination room. The building smelled of disinfectant and animal fur, a combination that somehow managed to be both clinical and comforting. Thomas laid Sargent on the examination table, watching as the dog's eyes tracked the veterinarian's movements. Even in his weakened state, Sargent maintained the alertness that marked him as a trained military animal. "Let me get his vitals first," Dr. Rodriguez said, placing a stethoscope against Sargent's chest. She worked with efficient compassion, her hands gentle but thorough as she examined the dog's condition. Heart rates elevated but strong. Breathing is shallow, probably due to the cold exposure and malnutrition. She lifted Sargent's lips to examine his gums, then checked his eyes with a small flashlight. "Dehydration is severe. I'm going to start him on IV fluids immediately." Thomas watched her work, feeling helpless and grateful in equal measure. This woman was risking her professional reputation to help an animal she'd never seen before, based on nothing more than his phone call and her own moral compass. "Doctor, I need you to know, I took him without the owner's permission. If anyone asks, you need to protect yourself. Doctor." Rodriguez paused in her examination, meeting Thomas's eyes directly. "Mr. Bradley, I've been a veterinarian for 15 years. I've seen neglect, abuse, and cruelty that would make you sick. I've also seen the legal system fail animals who couldn't speak for themselves." She returned to examining Sargent's wounds. "As far as I'm concerned, someone found an abandoned animal in distress and brought him here for emergency treatment. That's what my records will show." Relief flooded through Thomas, followed immediately by renewed worry. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." Dr. Rodriguez gently manipulated Sargent's left hind leg, the one that showed signs of old military injury. "He's lost about 30% of his body weight. These wounds on his muzzle are infected. The frostbite on his ears will heal, but it's going to be painful for a while." She inserted an IV catheter into Sargent's front leg with practiced skill. The dog flinched but didn't struggle, as if he understood that these hands meant help rather than harm. "The good news is that his spirit isn't broken. Look at his eyes. He's still fighting. Military working dogs are bred for resilience, and this one's got it in spades." Thomas felt a knot of tension ease in his chest. "He's going to make it?" "With proper care, nutrition, and time, yes, I believe he will." Dr. Rodriguez hung a bag of IV fluids and adjusted the drip rate. "But Mr. Bradley, this isn't just about physical recovery. This dog has been traumatized. He's going to need patience, consistency, and probably some behavioral rehabilitation." Thomas nodded, understanding more about trauma recovery than he wished he did. "How long before he's stable?" "I'd like to keep him here for at least 48 hours for observation. After that, he'll need weeks of careful recovery." She looked at Thomas seriously. "Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" "This isn't like adopting a puppy. This is taking responsibility for a damaged soldier." The weight of her words settled on Thomas's shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, he felt purposeful. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had a mission that mattered. "I'm prepared." Dr. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "Then let's get him settled for the night." They moved Sargent to a recovery kennel lined with heated blankets. The dog's eyes never left Thomas as they prepared his temporary home, tracking every movement with the focused attention of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "I'll stay with him tonight," Thomas said. "Mr. Bradley, that's not necessary." "It is for me." Thomas pulled a chair next to the kennel and settled in for a long vigil. He's been alone too long. He shouldn't wake up alone in another strange place. Dr. Rodriguez studied Thomas's face, seeing something there that made her nod with understanding. There's coffee in the break room and blankets in the supply closet. I'll be back first thing in the morning. After she left, Thomas sat in the dimly lit recovery room, listening to the quiet sounds of Sargent's breathing and the steady drip of IV fluids. Through the window, he could see snow beginning to fall again, the kind of heavy, steady snowfall that would make morning travel difficult. By dawn, Frank Morrison would discover that Sargent was gone. Sheriff Hutchinson would have to respond to the theft report, regardless of his personal feelings about the situation. Thomas would become a wanted man, and his quiet life as a school bus driver would be over. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it felt like liberation. He'd spent 3 years hiding from life, avoiding decisions, letting other people determine his future. Tonight he'd chosen action over safety, principle over convenience. For the first time since leaving the Army, he felt like himself again. Sargent stirred in his kennel, lifting his head to look at Thomas through the bars. Their eyes met, and Thomas saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion, gratitude mixed with wariness, hope tempered by experience. "I know, boy," Thomas whispered. "Trust is hard when people have let you down. But I'm not going anywhere." As if understanding, Sargent rested his head on his paws but kept his eyes open, watching Thomas with the vigilance of a soldier on guard duty. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, man and dog taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch, an ancient partnership between species that transcended words. Around 3 a.m., Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Henderson. Frank came home early, very drunk. Truck in the ditch at the end of his driveway. He's passed out in the cab. Thought you should know. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. Frank's early return could have been disastrous if Thomas had still been at the ranch, but it also meant the clock was ticking faster than expected. When Frank sobered up and discovered Sargent was missing, the situation would escalate quickly. Thomas typed back, "Thank you. Is Tommy safe? Boy's staying with me tonight. Said his uncle was acting scary before he left for town." At least Tommy was out of harm's way, one less variable to worry about in the complications that were coming. Thomas put his phone away and returned his attention to Sargent, who had been watching the exchange with interest. "Tomorrow's going to be rough," Thomas told the dog quietly. "People are going to say I stole you, that I had no right to take you from your legal owner. They might try to send you back." Sargent's tail moved slightly against the blanket, a weak but unmistakable response. "But here's what they don't understand," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength. "Some things are bigger than ownership papers. Some bonds are deeper than legal documents. You and I were soldiers. We understand duty, loyalty, sacrifice, and sometimes a soldier has to follow orders that come from something higher than chain of command." As dawn approached, painting the recovery room in shades of gray and gold, Thomas felt the calm certainty that had carried him through the most dangerous moments of his military service. He'd made his choice, crossed his line, committed himself to a path that led away from safety and toward something more important. Whatever consequences were coming, he would face them with Sargent at his side. They were both veterans now, both survivors, both deserving of the chance to heal together. The storm was coming, but for the first time in years, Thomas Bradley wasn't afraid of it. December 24th arrived with the kind of silence that only comes after heavy snowfall, when the world seems wrapped in cotton and even sound moves differently through the air. Thomas woke in the veterinary clinic's recovery room to find Sargent watching him with alert brown eyes, the dog's condition noticeably improved after 12 hours of IV fluids and warmth. "Morning, soldier," Thomas said softly, stretching the kinks from his neck after sleeping in a chair. "How are you feeling?" Sergeant's tail moved against his blanket, a weak but unmistakable wag that sent relief flooding through Thomas's chest. The dog was still painfully thin, but the desperate lethargy of hypothermia had lifted. His breathing was easier, and when Thomas approached the kennel, Sergeant lifted his head with something approaching eagerness. Dr. Rodriguez arrived at 7 a.m. with coffee and breakfast sandwiches, her face showing the professional satisfaction of someone whose patient had turned a crucial corner. His temperature is normal for the first time since you brought him in," she reported after checking Sergeant's vitals. "Hydration levels are improving and he ate a small portion of food during the night. We're not out of the woods yet, but the immediate crisis has passed." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "When can he come home?" "Another 24 hours for observation, then he's yours." "But Mr. Bradley—" She paused, her expression growing serious. "I need to tell you something. About an hour ago, I received a call from Sheriff Hutchinson." Thomas's stomach dropped. "And?" "Frank Morrison reported a theft. Specifically, he claims someone stole his German Shepherd sometime during the night of December 23rd. The sheriff wanted to know if I'd seen or treated any dogs matching that description." Thomas stood perfectly still, waiting for the other shoe to drop. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since making the decision to take Sergeant, the moment when his actions moved from rescue to crime in the eyes of the law. "What did you tell him?" Dr. Rodriguez met his eyes directly. "I told him the truth. A concerned citizen brought me an abandoned animal found in distress. I provided emergency veterinary care as required by my professional oath. I made no mention of ownership or theft." "Did he buy it?" "Sheriff Hutchinson is a good man, but he's also a law enforcement officer with a job to do. He'll be by this afternoon to see the dog for himself." She handed Thomas a manila folder. "These are copies of my medical records documenting Sergeant's condition when he arrived. Severe malnutrition, untreated wounds, signs of prolonged neglect and abuse. Whatever happens legally, there's now official documentation of what was done to this animal." Thomas took the folder with hands that trembled slightly. "Doctor, I want you to know how grateful—" "Don't thank me yet." Dr. Rodriguez's voice carried a warning. "Frank Morrison is claiming this dog is worth $15,000 as a trained military asset. If this goes to court, you could be facing felony theft charges." The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. $15,000 elevated simple theft to grand larceny, a serious felony that could result in years in prison. Frank wasn't just angry about losing his victim. He was positioning this as a major crime. "He's lying about the value," Thomas said. "Sergeant's been so abused he can barely walk. I know that, and my medical records will support that assessment. But Mr. Bradley, you need to understand what you're facing. Frank Morrison isn't just going to let this go. He's talking about pressing charges, demanding the dog's return, and making your life very difficult." Thomas looked at Sergeant, who was following the conversation with the intelligent attention that marked him as far more than simple property. The dog's eyes held trust now, something that had been completely absent when Thomas first found him. That trust was worth facing whatever Frank Morrison could throw at him. "I understand the risks, but I'm not giving him back." Dr. Rodriguez nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Then you need to prepare for a fight. I'd recommend getting legal counsel immediately." Thomas spent the next several hours making phone calls from the clinic's office. His first call was to a legal aid attorney in Great Falls who specialized in animal welfare cases. The conversation was discouraging. Montana's property laws strongly favored owners, even in cases of suspected abuse, and Thomas's decision to take Sergeant without legal authorization severely complicated any defense. "Your best hope is documenting the abuse so thoroughly that a judge decides the animal's welfare outweighs property rights," the attorney explained. "But I have to warn you, that's a long shot. Most judges will order the animal returned to its legal owner pending investigation. Thomas's second call was to his bank, checking his savings account balance against potential legal fees. The number was depressingly small, enough for maybe a month of serious legal representation, not the extended battle this case might require. His third call was the hardest, to Principal Chen explaining that he might not be able to drive his bus route for the foreseeable future. "Tom, the whole town is talking about what you did," Mrs. Chen said. "Opinion is divided, but I want you to know that you have supporters. The school board met this morning and we've agreed to give you administrative leave pending resolution of this situation. Your job will be waiting when this is over." The support meant more than Thomas could express, but it also drove home the reality that his actions had consequences extending far beyond himself. He'd dragged other people into his moral crusade, people who now faced difficult choices about where their loyalties lay. At 2 p.m., Sheriff Hutchinson arrived at the clinic with a deputy and a set of legal documents. Wade looked uncomfortable, like a man forced to enforce laws he didn't necessarily agree with. "Tom, I've got a warrant to examine the dog in question. Frank Morrison is claiming you stole his property. I rescued an abused animal, Wade." "There's a difference." "Maybe so, but that's for a judge to decide, not me." Sheriff Hutchinson's voice carried the weary authority of someone who'd seen too many situations where good intentions collided with legal reality. "I need to see the dog and get Dr. Rodriguez's professional assessment of his condition." They moved to the recovery room where Sargent lay on his heated bed, looking considerably better than he had 24 hours earlier, but still obviously malnourished and injured. Sheriff Hutchinson knelt beside the kennel, and Sargent's reaction was immediate and telling. The dog pressed himself against the back wall, trembling with fear. "Easy, boy," the sheriff said softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you." But Sargent's terror was unmistakable. Here was an animal who'd learned to associate law enforcement with return to abuse, who understood that official authority might not mean protection. "Doctor." Rodriguez provided a detailed explanation of Sargent's medical condition, showing photographs of his injuries and malnutrition. Sheriff Hutchinson listened with the poker face of a professional, but Thomas could see the conflict in his eyes. "Doc, in your professional opinion, was this animal being properly cared for?" "Absolutely not. This dog was suffering from severe neglect and abuse. Without intervention, he would have died within days." Sheriff Hutchinson stood slowly, his decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. "Tom, I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station for questioning. The dog will remain here under Dr. Rodriguez's care pending a court hearing." Thomas felt relief and dread in equal measure. Sargent wouldn't be returned to Frank immediately, but the legal battle was just beginning. As they prepared to leave, Thomas knelt beside Sargent's kennel one more time. The dog pushed his nose through the bars to touch Thomas's hand, a gesture of connection that spoke louder than any words. "I'll be back, soldier. That's a promise." Sargent's eyes held understanding and acceptance, the look of a veteran who'd learned that sometimes the fight continues even when you can't see the battlefield. Thomas Bradley walked out of the veterinary clinic in handcuffs, but he walked with his head high. He'd chosen conscience over convenience, moral duty over legal safety. Whatever came next, he could face it knowing he'd done the right thing. Behind him, Sargent watched through the window until Thomas disappeared from view, then settled back onto his blanket to wait. He'd waited before. He could wait again, because for the first time in years, he had reason to believe someone was coming back for him. The truth began unraveling in the most unexpected way, through a shoebox full of letters that 7-year-old Tommy Morrison brought to Mrs. Henderson's house on Christmas morning. Thomas had spent Christmas Eve in the county jail, released on his own recognizance after 12 hours of questioning. Sheriff Hutchinson had been professional but sympathetic, clearly uncomfortable with the legal complexities of a case where moral right and legal wrong seemed hopelessly tangled. Frank's demanding immediate return of his property, Wade had explained during the interview. He's also filed formal charges, grand theft, trespassing, and destruction of property for the chain you cut. The prosecutor's office will review the case after the holidays. Thomas had returned to his trailer on Christmas morning feeling hollow and exhausted, the weight of impending legal battles pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd checked his phone obsessively for updates from Dr. Rodriguez about Sargent's condition, but the clinic was closed for the holiday. The knock on his door came at 10 a.m. Mrs. Henderson standing on his front steps, with Tommy Morrison beside her, both of them bundled against the bitter cold. The boy carried a battered shoebox tied with string, his face solemn with the gravity of whatever mission had brought them here. "Mr. Bradley," Mrs. Henderson said, "Tommy has something he needs to show you. Something about his Uncle Frank and the dog." Thomas invited them inside, noting how Tommy's eyes darted nervously around the trailer as if expecting Frank to emerge from the shadows. The boy sat on the edge of Thomas's couch, clutching the shoebox like it contained explosives. "Tommy found this hidden in Frank's bedroom closet," Mrs. Henderson explained. "He brought it to me yesterday after his uncle passed out drunk. When I saw what was inside, I knew you needed to see it." Tommy untied the string with careful fingers and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of military documents, faded photographs, and letters in plastic sleeves. Thomas recognized the organization immediately. This was a soldier's memory box, the kind of carefully preserved collection that veterans created to hold the most important artifacts of their service. "These belong to my dad," Tommy said quietly. "Uncle Frank always said Dad's stuff got lost when he died, but it was hidden all this time." Thomas picked up the first letter, noting the return address. Corporal Kyle Morrison, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, Camp Fallujah, Iraq. The postmark was dated 3 weeks before Kyle's death. "Tommy, are you sure it's okay for me to read these?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Henderson says they might help Hunter. Dad loved dogs." "He would want someone to help Hunter." Thomas read the first letter, then the second, then a third, his understanding of Frank Morrison's trauma shifting with each page. Kyle's letters painted a picture completely different from the story Frank had told, a picture of a devoted canine handler who trusted his partner absolutely and credited him with saving lives daily. "Rex is the best partner I could ask for," Kyle had written in one letter. "Yesterday he found 3 IEDs on a route our convoy was supposed to take. Without him, we'd have lost half the squad. Frank, I know you think military dogs are just animals, but Rex is a soldier just like me. He deserves the same respect and care we'd give any member of our unit." Thomas continued reading, finding letter after letter that contradicted Frank's version of events. Kyle never wrote about Rex running away or abandoning him. Instead, the letters described a bond between man and dog that transcended simple training. In Kyle's final letter, dated 2 days before his death, the truth emerged in devastating clarity. "Frank, if you're reading this, something happened to me. I need you to know that Rex died trying to save me. We were clearing a building when insurgents opened fire. I ordered Rex to fall back and find help while I held position. He followed orders like the good soldier he is, but he came back for me even after I told him to stay safe. Rex took shrapnel trying to reach me, and he died licking my hand while we waited for medevac. Don't you ever let anyone say he was a coward. He was braver than most humans I know." The letter continued with specific instructions that made Thomas's heart race. "I've arranged for Rex to be buried with military honors, but I need you to promise me something. If the military ever offers you a chance to care for a canine veteran, take it. These dogs give everything for us, and they deserve to be cared for when their service is done. Promise me, Frank. Promise me you'll honor what these animals sacrifice for us." Thomas set down the letter with shaking hands, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Frank hadn't adopted Sargent to torture him. He'd adopted him to fulfill his brother's dying wish. But grief and alcohol and PTSD had twisted that intention into something monstrous. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said carefully, "does Frank know these letters exist?" "Tommy says his uncle never opened the box, just hid it away after Kyle's funeral and started drinking." She gestured toward a manila envelope at the bottom of the box. "There's more." Thomas opened the envelope and found official military documentation of Kyle Morrison's death. The after-action report described exactly what Kyle's letter had outlined: a K-9 handler who died protecting his unit while his dog died trying to save him. Rex received a posthumous commendation for heroic service. There was also a letter from the Marine Corps explaining the military working dog adoption program, specifically mentioning that Kyle Morrison had requested his brother be given first consideration if he wished to adopt a retired K-9. Thomas felt the pieces of Frank's psychological puzzle clicking into place. Frank had received the adoption opportunity exactly as Kyle had requested, but he'd never read the letters that would have explained his brother's true feelings about military dogs. Instead, he'd projected his grief and anger onto an innocent animal who represented everything Kyle had actually loved about military service. "Tommy," Thomas said gently, "does your uncle know you took this box?" The boy shook his head. "He was sleeping off his drinking. Mrs. Henderson says he probably won't wake up until tonight." Thomas looked at Mrs. Henderson, seeing understanding pass between them. This evidence could change everything, not just the legal case, but Frank's entire relationship with his own trauma. "Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to bring Frank to the veterinary clinic this afternoon? Tell him Tommy wants to see the dog one more time before Frank has him put down." "You think Frank will come?" "I think he needs to read these letters, and I think he needs to read them while looking at the dog he's been punishing for crimes that existed only in his imagination." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "It's risky. Frank's been unpredictable lately. So is leaving things the way they are." Thomas gathered the letters carefully, understanding that these fragile pieces of paper held the power to save or destroy multiple lives. "Tommy, would you be brave enough to help your uncle understand what your dad really wanted?" Tommy's young face was serious beyond his years. "Dad loved dogs. Uncle Frank used to love them too, before Dad died. Maybe if he remembers." Thomas felt hope stirring in his chest for the first time since his arrest. The truth had a power that transcended legal technicalities and property rights. If Frank Morrison could see past his grief to understand what his brother had actually believed about military dogs, perhaps this story could have a different ending. But first, Thomas had to convince a broken man to confront the lies he'd been telling himself for 17 years. He had to help Frank Morrison face the truth about his brother's death, his dog's loyalty, and his own misdirected rage. The meeting at the veterinary clinic would be the most important conversation of multiple lives, human and canine. Success might mean redemption and healing. Failure could mean losing Sargent forever and watching Frank Morrison disappear completely into his own darkness. Thomas looked at Kyle Morrison's final letter one more time, focusing on the words that seemed written directly to this moment. "Promise me you'll honor what these animals sacrifice for us." For the first time since this ordeal began, Thomas felt like he understood his true mission. He wasn't just saving a dog. He was fulfilling a promise made by one soldier to another, a promise that had been waiting 17 years to be kept. The truth would set them all free, but first they had to have the courage to face it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic's parking lot when Frank Morrison's pickup truck pulled in, engine rattling with the uncertainty of a man who'd spent the morning wrestling with demons he couldn't name, Mrs. Henderson had convinced him to come with a careful mixture of truth and misdirection. Tommy wanted to say goodbye to the dog before Frank took care of the situation permanently. Thomas watched from the clinic's window as Frank climbed out of his truck, moving with the careful deliberation of someone fighting a hangover and losing. Tommy emerged from the passenger side, clutching the shoebox of letters against his chest like armor. Mrs. Henderson followed, her face set with the determined expression of a woman who'd seen enough suffering and decided to do something about it. Dr. Rodriguez met them at the entrance, her professional demeanor masking the tension everyone felt. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for coming. I think it's important for you to see your dog's current condition before making any final decisions." Frank's response was a grunt that could have meant anything. He looked like a man who'd aged years in the past week, unshaven, hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of unexamined grief like a physical burden. His hands shook slightly, whether from alcohol withdrawal or emotion, Thomas couldn't tell. They moved through the clinic in tense silence, Tommy staying close to Mrs. Henderson, while Frank followed with the reluctant steps of someone approaching his own execution. Thomas brought up the rear, Kyle Morrison's letters tucked inside his jacket like evidence in a trial that would determine multiple fates. Sargent was awake when they entered the recovery room, his condition dramatically improved after 48 hours of proper care. The dog's coat had regained some of its luster, his eyes were clear and alert, and he'd gained enough strength to sit upright when visitors entered. But his reaction to Frank's presence was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed himself against the back of his kennel, trembling with fear. "Jesus," Frank whispered, and Thomas heard 17 years of self-deception crack in that single word. "Uncle Frank," Tommy said softly. "Hunter's scared of you." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. "Hunter? That's what I call him. You never told me his real name." Frank stared at Sargent through the kennel bars, seeing perhaps for the first time not a symbol of military failure but an individual animal who'd learned to fear him. The dog's terror was unmistakable, and even Frank's alcohol-damaged conscience couldn't rationalize it away. Dr. Rodriguez spoke with clinical precision. This animal was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple untreated wounds when he arrived. Without intervention, he would have died within days. "I gave him food," Frank said weakly. "When? How often? What kind?" Dr. Rodriguez's questions came rapid fire, demanding specificity that Frank couldn't provide. Thomas stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. "Frank, there's something you need to see. Something Tommy found in your closet." Frank's attention shifted to the shoebox in his nephew's hands, and Thomas saw recognition flicker across his features. "That's Kyle's stuff. I told you it was lost." "You lied," Tommy said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "You lied about a lot of things." Thomas took the box from Tommy and opened it carefully, removing Kyle's final letter. "Frank, did you ever read what your brother wrote before he died?" Frank's face went white. "I couldn't. After the funeral, I couldn't." "Then you need to read it now." Thomas held out the letter. "Because everything you think you know about how Kyle died is wrong." Frank took the letter with hands that shook visibly, unfolding the paper as if it might explode. Thomas watched Frank's face as he read, seeing 17 years of carefully constructed lies crumble with each sentence. "Rex died trying to save me," Frank read aloud, his voice breaking. "He followed orders like the good soldier he is, but he came back for me even after I told him to stay safe." The letter fluttered to the floor as Frank's legs gave out. He sank into a chair, his face a mask of devastation and dawning comprehension. He didn't run away. Rex didn't abandon Kyle. "No," Thomas said gently. He died a hero's death, trying to save your brother, just like Kyle wrote. Frank looked at Sargent through tear-filled eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not the betrayer of his imagination, but the inheritor of a legacy he'd been too broken to understand. And I've been punishing him for something he never did. Tommy approached his uncle cautiously, the way children learn to navigate adult emotional wreckage. Dad wanted you to take care of dogs like Hunter. He wrote it down. Thomas retrieved another letter from the box, this one containing Kyle's specific request that Frank honor military working dogs if given the opportunity. Frank read it through twice, his face cycling through grief, rage, and something that might have been redemption. "All these years," Frank whispered. "All these years I've been hating the wrong thing." Dr. Rodriguez moved to Sargent's kennel, opening the door carefully. "Would you like to meet him properly? His real name is Sargent, by the way, same as the dog your brother loved." Frank looked terrified at the prospect, but Tommy's small hand slipped into his, providing anchor and encouragement. Together they approached the kennel where Sargent waited with the patient courage that had carried him through years of abuse. "Easy, boy," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry." "God, I'm so sorry." Sargent studied Frank's face with the intelligence that marked him as far more than simple property. Slowly, carefully, the dog extended his nose toward Frank's outstretched hand. The moment of contact, predator and prey choosing trust over fear, broke something fundamental in Frank Morrison's damaged psyche. "Kyle would hate what I became," Frank sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "He'd hate what I did to you." Thomas felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge between destruction and redemption. "Frank, Kyle would understand. He'd understand that grief can make people do things they never thought possible. But he'd also want you to choose differently now." Frank looked up, his face raw with 17 years of suppressed emotion. "What do I do? How do I make this right?" "You start by letting Sargent heal," Thomas said. "You let him go to someone who can give him the care Kyle would have wanted him to have. And then you get help, Mrs." Henderson added firmly. "Real help, not just drowning in bottles. Tommy needs you to be the man Kyle thought you could be." Frank nodded slowly, the weight of decision visible in his shoulders. He looked at Thomas with something approaching respect. "You'd take care of him? Really take care of him?" "I'd take care of him the way Kyle would have wanted, the way he deserves after everything he's been through." Frank stood slowly, his hand still extended toward Sargent. The dog allowed the contact, perhaps sensing the change in the man who'd been his tormentor. "Then he's yours, legally, officially, whatever you need. I'll sign whatever papers." The relief in the room was palpable, but Thomas knew this was only the beginning. Frank Morrison had a long road ahead, therapy, sobriety, rebuilding his relationship with Tommy, but for the first time in 17 years he was pointed in the right direction. As they prepared the paperwork for Sargent's transfer, Tommy approached the kennel one more time. Sargent, you're going to be okay now. Mr. Bradley will take good care of you." Sargent's tail wagged slightly, the first truly happy gesture Thomas had seen from him. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed, that the fear and pain were finally ending. Outside the clinic, Frank Morrison shook Thomas's hand with the grip of a man trying to hold on to sobriety and sanity simultaneously. "Thank you," he said simply, "for saving him from me." "Thank you for letting him go," Thomas replied. It took courage. As Frank's truck disappeared down the snowy road, Thomas felt the weight of completed missions settling on his shoulders. He'd saved Sargent, but more importantly, he'd helped break a cycle of trauma that had claimed too many casualties. The truth had indeed set them all free, Frank from his misdirected grief, Sargent from his suffering, Tommy from a household poisoned by unresolved trauma, and Thomas from the paralysis that had gripped him since Sarah's death. Some crossings you make alone, others you make together. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that the crossing was always meant to happen, that broken souls find each other not by accident, but by design. Sometimes life breaks us in ways we never expected. Frank Morrison carried 17 years of grief, punishing an innocent animal for tragedies that existed only in his wounded imagination. But even the deepest pain can be healed when we find the courage to face the truth about our losses and choose love over anger. Thomas Bradley, a widower who'd given up on purpose, discovered that saving others often saves ourselves. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to choose redemption over resentment, healing over hurting. Whether you're 55 or 75, whether you've lost a spouse, a child, a dream, or a sense of who you used to be, your story isn't over. Every morning offers the choice between staying broken or building something beautiful from the pieces. Like Sargent, who learned to trust again despite years of abuse, we can all choose hope over fear. The bonds we form with others, human or animal, can heal wounds we thought were permanent. Your next chapter might be your best chapter if you have the courage to turn the page. What relationship in your life helped you heal from a difficult loss? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in caring for someone or something that needed you more than you realized?